Imagine someone drops a Stone Age human into the middle of a modern city. Not a caveman from a cartoon. Not a grunting, hunched, dim-witted creature. A real one. A fully modern Homo sapiens, anatomically identical to you, born roughly 50,000 years ago, raised in a hunter-gatherer band on the African savanna, or the cold steppe of Ice Age Europe. Same brain, same body, same capacity for language, emotion, strategy, and social intelligence. What happens? The answer is stranger, more humbling and more revealing about your own life than you might expect. The first thing you need to understand is what this person actually is. For most of human history, the popular image of prehistoric humans as slow, brutish, and intellectually limited has been systematically demolished by decades of archaeological and anthropological research. Paleoanthropologist Richard Klein at Stanford has spent decades studying the cognitive and behavioral modernity of Upper Paleolithic humans. And the evidence is unambiguous. The people who painted the walls of Chauvet Cave in France 36,000 years ago, who carved the Lion Man of Hohenstein Stadel 40,000 years ago, who navigated open ocean to reach Australia at least 65,000 years ago, were not primitive. They were us. Fully, completely, cognitively us. So when your Stone Age visitor steps into the modern world, they bring with them a mind every bit as powerful as yours. What they lack is not intelligence. What they lack is context. Let's reconstruct what the first few hours look like. The noise hits first. Modern cities produce a constant background roar that sits at around 70 decibels, even in quieter neighborhoods, roughly equivalent to a vacuum cleaner running continuously at close range. For a person whose sensory baseline was set in a world of wind, birdsong, animal movement, and human voices, this level of ambient noise would be genuinely disorienting. Not painful necessarily, but deeply unnatural. Research on Indigenous communities transitioning to urban environments, including studies reviewed by environmental psychologist Eleanor Ratcliffe at the University of Surrey, has consistently shown that sustained exposure to urban noise produces measurable stress responses even in people who grew up in quieter rural settings. For someone whose threat detection system was calibrated for a world where an unexpected sound usually meant a predator, the city would feel like it was permanently on the edge of something dangerous. The smells would be equally overwhelming. Exhaust fumes, food, chemical cleaning products, thousands of humans in close proximity, none of it mapped to anything in their existing sensory vocabulary. But here's where it gets interesting. Within hours, your prehistoric visitor would begin doing something you might not expect. They would start reading people. Hunter-gatherer social intelligence is extraordinarily sophisticated. Anthropologist Robin Dunbar at the University of Oxford proposed what became known as Dunbar's number, the idea that human brains evolved specifically to manage social groups of roughly 150 individuals, tracking relationships, alliances, hierarchies, reputations, and emotional states across a complex web of connections. A prehistoric human did this constantly because their survival literally depended on it. Knowing who to trust, who was angry, who was lying, who was generous, and who was dangerous was not a social nicety. It was a survival skill as critical as tracking game. Put that person in a city, and they would apply the same faculty immediately. They would watch faces. They would read body language with extraordinary precision. They would notice micro-expressions, postural shifts, the subtle signs of dominance and submission in a crowd, things that most modern humans have largely stopped consciously registering. Because our social survival doesn't depend on reading them accurately anymore, your prehistoric visitor would be, by the standards of modern psychology, an exceptionally gifted social reader. They would also be immediately drawn to children. In hunter-gatherer societies, studied extensively by developmental psychologist David Lancy at Utah State University, Child rearing is a communal affair. Children are not the exclusive responsibility of their parents. They are raised by the group, and every adult in the band carries some responsibility for every child. The idea of a child alone, unsupervised, in distress, with adults walking past without intervening, would be viscerally wrong to a prehistoric human. In a way that goes beyond cultural discomfort, it would feel like a violation of something deep and biological. Similarly, they would be disturbed by the elderly walking alone, uncared for, separated from the group. In hunter-gatherer bands, as documented by anthropologist Polly Wiesner at the University of Utah, elders are the information repositories of the group, the carriers of survival knowledge accumulated over a lifetime. Leaving them isolated and unsupported would make no sense. It would be, from a purely practical standpoint, a catastrophic waste. Now let's talk about what they would be genuinely brilliant at. Give a 50,000-year-old human a few days to recover from the sensory overload, and they would begin to adapt at a speed that might surprise you. The human brain's neuroplasticity, its ability to rewire itself in response to new environments, is not a modern invention. It was essential in the Paleolithic, where a band might move through radically different ecosystems across the course of a year, requiring constant environmental learning. A prehistoric human who could not rapidly learn the rules of a new environment did not survive. They would learn to navigate the city by landmarks. They would observe social hierarchies and figure out quickly who held power and how that power was expressed. They would identify food sources with remarkable speed, because reading a landscape for food, whether it's a berry bush, a root-rich riverbank, or a grocery store, is the same underlying cognitive skill applied to a different substrate. Researcher Herman Pontzer at Duke University, who has studied the metabolic and physical profiles of modern Hadza hunter-gatherers in Tanzania, has documented that these individuals can cover 12 to 15 kilometers per day on foot without significant fatigue. Your prehistoric visitor would outpace virtually every modern city dweller physically without breaking a sweat. But some things would genuinely baffle them. The food would be almost incomprehensible. Not the variety, but the taste. A hunter-gatherer diet is extraordinarily diverse by modern standards, but it is also almost entirely unprocessed. The concentrated sweetness of a modern soft drink, the engineered saltiness of packaged food, the specific fat profiles of fast food, these are not natural flavors. They are flavors engineered in the 20th century to trigger reward responses in a brain that evolved to seek out rare caloric sources. Your prehistoric visitor's first encounter with a soft drink would likely trigger an intense response, possibly followed by deep suspicion, because in their world, something that's sweet in that quantity did not exist in nature. Their brain would register it as extraordinary, but their gut instinct might well tell them something was wrong. Sitting would confuse them too. Not chairs specifically, but the duration. Modern office workers sit for an average of 9 to 10 hours per day, a pattern of sedentary behavior that has no precedent in human evolutionary history. Bioarchaeologist Timothy Ryan at Penn State, studying skeletal remains across the Paleolithic to Neolithic transition, has documented measurable reductions in bone density and robustness that correlate with declining physical activity patterns. A prehistoric human, accustomed to near-constant low-level movement, would find prolonged sitting deeply uncomfortable, not because they're physically incapable of it, but because their body was calibrated for motion. They would fidget, they would stand, they would pace, they would, by the standards of any modern open-plan office, be profoundly distracting. And at night, something else would happen. They would look up at the sky and find almost nothing there. Light pollution now obscures more than 99% of stars visible to the naked eye in most urban areas. For a person whose navigational system, whose seasonal calendar, whose entire cosmological framework was built on a sky containing thousands of visible stars, this would not be a minor inconvenience. It would be like removing most of the words from their language. The sky they had navigated by, told stories about, used to mark the passage of seasons, and the movement of herds would simply be gone. Here is the counterintuitive twist. If you reverse the experiment, if you dropped yourself into a 50,000-year-old hunter-gatherer band, you would fare far worse than your prehistoric visitor fares in your city. You would be physically weaker, less observant, less capable of reading the landscape, less able to navigate without a screen, less skilled at every practical survival task, and profoundly ignorant of the accumulated environmental knowledge that every member of that band carries as a matter of basic competence. Your prehistoric visitor is disoriented in your world, but they are not lost in it. You would be lost in theirs. Because the gap between you is not intelligence. It was never intelligence. It is accumulated knowledge, and the specific environment in which that knowledge was built. Strip away the context, and what you're left with is two versions of the same mind, equally powerful, equally curious, and equally capable of adapting to a world that was not made for them. Your prehistoric visitor would stare at your city and try to understand it. And somewhere, in the wiring of a brain that hasn't fundamentally changed in 300,000 years, you're still doing exactly the same thing.